Tonight I want to talk to you about the arguments for evolution are outdated and often illogical. I think this one, perhaps, of all the ones, are the most, if you understand the word, damning. In other words, they have a flaunted, egotistical concept of their work being scientific, while ours is merely by faith. But I want you to pay attention to this. Look at the structure of their proof, the fossil gaps. And I tried to make an emphasis there on the plural. So follow this. If evolution happened, we would expect something. The fossil record should show continuous and gradual changes from the bottom to the top layers. What are we saying? That from the first cell that accidentally got zapped by lightning or something and turned into life to the, and we already found out that there are no two-cell animals. It skips right on up. So, but we would expect it every place, and it's not there. Actually, so that's what should happen, but actually, many gaps or discontinuities. In other words, they say we follow it here, and then you have to jump clear up to here, and then it starts again, appear throughout the fossil record. So I'm quoting, most of this is from scientific works. Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West, Volume 2, says there is no more conclusive refuting of Darwinism than that furnished by paleontology, study of paleons, of old things. Simple probability indicates that fossil hordes can only be test samples. Each sample, then, should represent a different stage of evolution, and there ought to be merely transitional types. There ought to be some evidence of an animal that we never saw before, but we can tell it comes somewhere in between the fly and the mosquito. It comes somewhere between the fox and the zebra, just before it turned into one, after it turned out of the other, transitional type. So it would have no definition, it would have no species. We wouldn't know what to call it because it was just a thing in between. Instead of this, we find perfectly stable and unaltered forms persevering through long ages, forms that have not developed themselves on the fitness principle. You can see that there are animals beside it that are better fit for survival, but they just keep on going. But appear suddenly and at once in their definitive shape, that do not thereafter evolve toward better adaptation, but become rarer and finally disappear. They become extinct rather than evolve, while quite different forms crop up again. What unfolds itself in ever-increasing richness of form is the great classes and kinds of living beings which exist aboriginally. Originally and then aboriginally, the very earliest beginning, and exist still without transition types in the grouping of today. And he put the emphasis of in the grouping today. George Gaylord Simpson, Tempo and Mode in Evolution, you can hear in this, he is believing in evolution. But he says this regular absence of transitional forms is not confined to mammals. He admits it's in mammals. We don't see this transitional forms in mammals, but is almost an almost universal phenomenon. Phenomenon is a big word for thing, a thing, as has long been noted by paleontologists. It is true of almost all orders of all classes of animals, both vertebrate with a backbone and invertebrate. A fortiori, it is also true of the classes themselves, and of the major animal phyla, and it is apparently also true of analogous categories of plants. So they can see plants in a lot of richness, but then they have other plants that seem more advanced, but there's no in-between ones, none. George Gaylord Simpson also said on page 23 in the same book, the geologic record did not then and still does not yield a finely graduated chain of slow and progressive evolution. You catch what he's saying? It doesn't show what they say had to happen. In other words, there are not enough intermediates. There are very few cases where one can find a gradual transition from one species to another, and very few cases where one can look at a part of the fossil record and actually see that organisms were improving in the sense of becoming better adapted. What we're hearing here is the admission that the obvious evidence of evolution isn't there. I remember hearing an interview, reading of an interview where a famous unbeliever, they said, what if when you die you stand before God and he says, why didn't you believe? And he will say, lack of evidence. And here his great hold of truth is in evolution is lacking the evidence, yet he truly believes. Truly believes. Francisco J. Ayala and James W. Valentine, Evolving the Theory and Process of Organic Evolution. You can tell these are believers. He says there are about 25 major living subdivisions, phyla is what the technical term is of this grouping, of the animal kingdom alone, all with gaps between them that are not bridged by known intermediates. It's as though somebody made them separately. Stephen Jay Gould, Evolution's Erratic Pace. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Trade secret, we don't want this getting out. We don't want people knowing that the king has no clothes. You know the story? The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. And so it had to be this way, we suppose. However reasonable, it is not the evidence of fossils. We guess that's it because we reason it this way. It's logical. If you start with evolution, it's logical that they had to be connected, but we don't have any proof with the fossils. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, and I think he's comparing us to people by faith who read the Bible, yet to preserve our favored account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad, we never see the very process we profess to study. This is after all these years, all the fossil records that they have been scouring the world for, and he says, well, the evidence isn't there. Niles Eldridge, an invertebrate paleontologist. I bet it's hard to be a paleontologist when you don't have a backbone. No, he's a paleontologist of invertebrate animals. He stated in the Manchester Guardian in an article called Missing, Believed Non-Existent. How about that? But the smooth transition from one form of life to another, which is implied in the theory, is not borne out by the facts. The search for missing links between various living creatures, like humans and apes, is probably fruitless because they probably never existed as distinct transitional types. There probably was never a transitional animal. He goes on, but no one has yet found any evidence of such transitional creatures. Think how complete that statement is. But no one has yet found any evidence of such transitional creatures. Thus, this oddity has been attributed to gaps in the fossil record, which gradualists expected to fill when rock strata of the proper age had been found. In the last decade, however, geologists have found rock layers of all divisions of the last 500 million years, and no transitional forms were contained in them. If it is not the fossil record which is incomplete, then it must be the theory. I can only see him weeping over his cup of hot tea. At the most fundamental level, a big gap exists between forms of life whose cells have nuclei, and he gives an example of eukaryotes, such as plants, animals, and fungi. Those have nuclei, and those that don't, parkaryotes, such as bacteria and blue-green algae. So I don't know what that means, but some of them have nuclei and others, and he says there's no transition form between them. We don't know which one went which way, which we ought to know. Fossil links are also missing, and this is a, you see the one in front of the between? Okay. So this was such a long one, and I broke it up with other quotes. So you understand what I'm doing with this. This fossil links are also missing between. This is going to go on for quite a while with inserts. All right. Between, number one, large groupings of plants. Number two, between single-celled forms of life and invertebrates, animals without backbones. Among insects, among insects. Number three, between invertebrates and vertebrates, animals with backbones. Without backbones, with backbones. Homer Smith says concerning this very transition, from fish to philosopher, as our present information stands, however, the gap remains unbridged. Now notice this admission. And the best place to start the evolution of the vertebrates is in the imagination. We have no fact to point to. He goes on, this listing. Between fish and amphibians. Number five, between amphibians and reptiles. Here's an additional quote concerning that. Evolutionists believe that amphibians evolved into reptiles, and that evolution with either the Diadectus or Semoria as the transition. All right, but the problem is this. By the evolutionists' own timescale, this transition occurred 35 million years, MY, he's going to, instead of saying million years, he's just going to use MY after this. This transition occurred 35 million years after the earliest reptile, Hylonomus, a cotylosaur. Here's a clue to your thinking, however. A parent cannot appear 35 million years after his child. They find the transition appears 35 million years after the earliest reptile. What? The scattered location of these fossils also present problems for the evolutionists. Taylor, page 60, there are no intermediate forms between finned and limbed creatures in the fossil collections of the world. Just no. The listing goes on. Number 6, between reptiles and mammals. Thomas Kemp, Mammal-like Reptiles, Origin of Mammals. gaps at a lower taxonomic level, this is their evolutionary scale, species and genera are practically universal. The gaps are practically universal in the fossil record of the mammal-like reptiles. In no single adequately documented case is it possible to trace a transition, species by species, from one genus to another. Now, adequately documented indicates there have been some that somebody just said it, but was no documentation. Number 7, between reptiles and birds. How confident they sound when the birds devolved from the dinosaurs, reptiles turned to birds. W. Swinton, The Origin of Birds, says, the evolutionary origin of birds is largely a matter of deduction. It had to happen that way. It just had to. There is no fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. We have no evidence, but we figure it had to happen. Number 8, between primates and other mammals. And number 9, between apes and other primates. Lyle Watson, The Water People. Modern apes, for instance, seem to have sprung out of nowhere, almost like creation. They have no yesterday, no fossil record, and the true origin of modern humans, of upright, naked, tool-making, big-brained beings, is, if we are to be honest with ourselves, an equally mysterious matter. We have no fossil evidence. Donald Johanson, Maitland 80, Lucy, The Beginning of Humankind, they say this: at any rate, modern gorillas, orangs, and chimpanzees spring out of nowhere, as it were. They are here today, they have no yesterday, unless one is able to find a faint foreshadowings of it in the Dryopithecids. And I don't know what that is, sorry. Now, the summation here is this. We finally ended that big, long list. In fact, entire chains are missing, not mere links. You know, a link in a chain, it's not like a missing link. It's a missing chain. The fossil record has been studied so thoroughly that it is safe to conclude that these gaps are not just apparent, they are real. They will never be filled. Nilsson said, it may therefore be firmly maintained that it is not even possible to make a caricature, one of those wild drawings that exaggerates, of an evolution out of paleobiological facts. The fossil material is now so complete that it has been possible to construct new classes, and the lack of transitional series cannot be explained as due to the scarcity of the material. We've been at it too long. We've got examples from every area, every era. The deficiencies are real. They will never be filled. He says this is the facts that we look at. Norman Newell, writing The Adventures in Earth History, he wrote an article, and he says, experience shows that the gaps which separate the highest categories may never be bridged in the fossil record. Many of the discontinuities tend to be more and more emphasized with increased collecting. The more we collect, the more obvious is the absences. My concluding thought in a book, David Heiser, by Evolution and Christian Faith, he says this: a person may choose any group of animals or plants, large or small, or pick one at random. He may then go to a library, and with some patience, he will be able to find a qualified author who says that the evolutionary origin of that form is not known. So what are they talking about? Why are they so superior to people who just believe things by faith. This is a big faith thing. It's the faith that God did not create.